This is part 2 of the Chapter 7 video lecture. We were talking about stratification as a concept and had talked about various types of systems. All that being said, let's consider how America tends to be stratified today. The layers of stratification come in the form of socioeconomic status, or SES. So we'll use this as a ruler or a guide to be able to differentiate among these individuals. The upper class here might be regarded as the top 1% of the population. Weblen talks about them as the leisure class. In general, their income will be 255 times that of the median or the average. These end up being the people who hold positions of power and who have greater prestige. The middle class would be in between, of course, and those are going to be made up of non-manual labor jobs that pay significantly over the poverty line. If you will, this will include some typically white collar, but we may also have some working class wages. Part of the benefits of the post-World War II economic development is that it helped to lift some of the working class into the middle class and thereby expand the middle class. So even though we talk about a middle, it's not like the upper class and lower classes or the poor are equidistant. They divide things up into thirds. The middle class clearly is disproportionately a larger middle. The middle class ends up still expanding even though manufacturing ends up being in decline, and you end up seeing it being replaced by low-wage service work. As a result, even though you might see a general expansion of the middle class, there might be a growing sense of inequality even in that particular class. Look how it is that to get access to middle class opportunities today. 30, 40 years ago, it was possible to get access to that class with a high school education. In that time, it seems increasingly likely that it's necessary to earn a college degree to have access to those kinds of jobs. But consider this. First off, only about a quarter of the population ends up having some kind of college educational experience. So contributing to the stratification is the fact that only a quarter of the population potentially has the chance for earning the kinds of wages that end up creating or being in the middle class. Why that? There can be several factors, of course, but one of which is increasing cost. And over the past 2 or 3 decades, you've seen such dramatic increases in the cost of education that perhaps individuals are now encountering a second barrier to being able to get good middle class type jobs, and that is because of the increased cost, individuals won't have access to college. You'll also need to take into account that access to the middle class jobs may change because of changes in the family structures. This too because of a number of larger societal changes. So you'll see more one-parent families, and that may mean that there are fewer resources to be dedicated towards the care and raising of children. At the bottom then, we'll talk about the poor, but understand that poor tends to be a little better described than the middle class. Poor would be according to a federal standard when it comes down to the issuance of some benefits to individuals. Poor would mean $22,000 a year to manage a family of 4. Understand that these are poor. There is a tier right above them, a strata above them, called the working poor, who still may qualify for some federal benefits, but nonetheless are earning their monies through work of some kind. If we're seeing this on a national scale in the United States, what is it like on a global scale? What you start to see is a stratification between developing, and undeveloped nations, much like we had talked about an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class. Inequality seems to be on the march increasing. This would seem paradoxical in light of the fact that with globalization there's more economic opportunity conferred upon the lower class individuals, but apparently there is an advantage to be accrued from technology, and those who gain that advantage relatively early on seem to be able to use it to greater benefit. Think of it by way of metaphor as the equivalent to compound interest when borrowing or lending money, so that there is an accumulative effect the more time passes. Technology may have given the developed world an advantage. It's not so much that there's anything intrinsic to it as it is that perhaps the Western world was the first to take advantage of certain technologies as arising during the Industrial Revolution. Now, Montesquieu, who we had talked about earlier, instead argued that this was because there was something superior about Western culture, but generally such a view has been discounted as being racist on its face. Another explanation for why the developed West has been able to gain a superior position and that the gaps of inequality grew was because that Western nations were able to use other nations as colonies to exploit them that way. And though for the most part the idea of European colonization has ended, except for a few very small exceptions, there's still the fact that the so-called former colonies had been exploited. That meant that they were at a disadvantage once they were freed from being colonies to be able to gain economic opportunity. So that put them at an unequal starting place when it came to economic development, unlike with the West. Consider then, too, in talking about stratification, the idea of social mobility, the idea that individuals will end up being able to do something about it. Social mobility, we'll talk about, of course, the ability to go from one strata to the next. We see one researcher by the name of Sorokin who talks about the way in which mobility should be viewed not simply as the fact of an individual moving it, but of a group. Jeffrey Sachs then suggests that you also take into account geography and agriculture and how those may be factors that can affect social mobility. I think that he talks about places like parts of Asia and of Africa having a climate which might not allow for the same level of industrialization as you might have seen farther up north on the globe or farther south. Horizontal mobility will mean that we're seeing individuals or groups of individuals moving from one status to another, but essentially along the terms of advancement in a particular society, where vertical mobility refers to the rise or fall of individuals from one strata to another. Keep in mind, of course, that vertical mobility could be up or could be down, and that this applies not just to individuals but also to groups. If you want to look at the nature of mobility, consider the idea of structural mobility, or the ways in which there is movement from changes in the economy. Very broadly speaking, when you look at a nation that is developing and approaches being developed, you start to see a decrease in the size of families. Why? Because larger families were seen as a form of social insurance for the parents. In a more advanced society, more developed society, you'll see opportunities to put money away and therefore be able to provide care for parents when they choose to retire. There's less of a need for children to be the ones to have to provide that as a service. Then there is exchange mobility, which talks about individuals from one group making a change, but that their changes are canceled out because members of the group that they've moved to themselves go to the group that has just sent out a group of individuals. So what you get as an effect is essentially in toto a zero-sum equation, that there's no real change overall. And finally, you get status attainment models, which end up trying to give an idea for individuals when it comes down to mobility, looking for those characteristics of more desirable occupations so that they'll end up being able to figure out what's going on. There is an aside here towards the end of the chapter talking about the so-called death tax or estate tax and the way in which it ends up affecting mobility because it prevents the accrued wealth of one generation passing unfettered to the next generation. At the moment, no such tax exists. In our country, it had been, if I understand it correctly, that a 55% tax fell upon an estate, but only if the estate had value in excess of 1 million, and then the 55% would be the amount over 1 million. Well, as we talked about earlier about the upper class being the 1%, you'll find that the people who die and leave an estate or property in excess of $1 million is a pretty small percentage of overall society. Itself, perhaps 1% or 2%. And yet, by casting it as a death tax, there was a way of playing up to a populist kind of image that it is unfair to people, even though what really turned out to be the case was that it was unfair to those who are rich. So that's all I've got to say for Chapter 7 in the video lectures for that material.